My name is Maya. I am 33 years old, and until our fifth wedding anniversary, I thought I was married to a man who respected me. I brought a custom bouquet and first-class plane tickets to Monaco to my husband's office to surprise him, but the entire company was celebrating his engagement to the female CEO. My husband kissed her, then held up a massive diamond ring as the crowd cheered. I turned around and walked away. I immediately canceled the trip, froze all our joint accounts, and withdrew my 74% stake in the company, a stake worth $800 million. 10 minutes later, my phone showed 110 missed calls. Before continuing, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth and power. The day began with the kind of naive optimism that only a woman deeply in love and completely in the dark could muster. Sterling Cloud headquarters was a monument to modern corporate greed, a towering structure of steel and tinted glass that dominated the Atlanta skyline. Julian, my husband of 5 years today, served as the vice president of sales. I navigated the revolving doors, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. In one hand, I carried a leather folio containing the Monaco tickets, a trip I meticulously planned down to the private yacht charter. In the other hand, I held an arrangement of white orchids, his absolute favorite. I bypassed the main reception desk with the confidence of a spouse who belonged there. I stepped into the glass elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse level where the executive suites and main atrium were located. My heart fluttered with genuine excitement. Julian had been working late for months, claiming the pressure from his new CEO Victoria Sterling was immense. He had skipped my alumni association dinners, missed my family gatherings, and barely looked up from his laptop during our quiet evenings at home. I had justified his absence, telling myself he was building our future. I wanted this anniversary to be the moment we reconnected, a lavish reminder of the vow we took to put each other first. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor, and the stainless steel doors slid silently open. I stepped out of the elevator and was immediately hit by a wall of sound. The executive atrium was packed with over 100 people. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The room was decorated with tasteful silver and white balloons. For a brief fleeting second, a warm flush of emotion washed over me. I actually thought Julian had planned an elaborate surprise party for our anniversary. I thought the late nights and the secrecy were all leading up to this grand romantic gesture in front of his colleagues. I clutched the orchids tighter and moved toward the center of the room, gently pushing my way through the throng of cheering software engineers and marketing executives. But as the crowd parted, the illusion shattered with devastating force. Julian was not looking for me. He was standing on a raised platform near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking perfectly groomed in the custom-tailored charcoal suit I had bought for his birthday. Standing directly in front of him was Victoria Sterling. She was a tall, strikingly severe woman of 38, wearing a white designer sheath dress that looked suspiciously like a modern bridal gown. The room fell into an expectant hush as Julian raised a microphone to his mouth. His voice, the same voice that had whispered vows to me 5 years ago, echoed through the atrium. He looked deep into Victoria's eyes. "You have transformed this company, Victoria, but more importantly, you have transformed me," he declared, his tone dripping with a reverence he had never once directed at me. "I have spent years surrounded by mediocrity, settling for small lives and small ambitions. But Victoria, you are the only woman on my level. You are an empire builder." My breath caught in my throat, choking me. The white orchids in my hand suddenly felt like dead weight. Julian dropped smoothly to one knee, the microphone still held to his lips. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a velvet box, snapping it open to reveal a diamond ring so large it caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "Will you do me the ultimate honor of becoming my wife?" he asked. Victoria let out a practiced, breathless gasp. She nodded dramatically, extending her hand. Julian slid the ring onto her finger, stood up, and pulled her into a passionate, lingering kiss. The entire atrium erupted into deafening applause and enthusiastic cheers. Champagne glasses clinked, people whistled. It was a flawless picture of corporate royalty. And I was standing less than 20 feet away. As Julian broke the kiss and turned to smile at his adoring audience, his eyes swept across the front of the crowd. His gaze locked directly onto mine. Time stopped. I saw the exact moment the realization hit him, but to my absolute horror, he did not panic. There was no guilt in his eyes. There was no scramble to explain or hide. Instead, his lips curled into a cold, arrogant smirk. He tightened his grip around Victoria's waist, pulling her flush against his side, displaying her like a trophy he had won. He looked at me as if I were a pest that had wandered in from the street. Victoria followed his line of sight. Her eyes landed on me, taking in my natural hair, my tailored but understated blazer, and the flowers in my hand. She recognized me immediately from the company holiday party. Her lips parted, and over the roar of the cheering crowd, she deliberately mouthed a single word at me. Pathetic. I stood frozen, the cruelty of the moment paralyzing my limbs. Suddenly, I felt a gentle tug on my sleeve. It was Marcus, a junior sales associate who had always been polite to me during office visits. He pulled me slightly behind a marble pillar, his face pale with secondhand embarrassment. Maya, I am so sorry, he whispered rapidly, glancing over his shoulder. We all thought you two signed divorce papers months ago. Julian told everyone your marriage was a mistake. My voice felt like sandpaper as I finally managed to speak. A mistake? Marcus swallowed hard, looking deeply uncomfortable. He said your boutique PR hustle was nothing compared to his elite corporate grind. He told the whole executive team that he needed a woman with real power, someone who understood generational wealth and legacy, not a small-time party planner. He said Victoria was his ticket to the upper echelon. The audacity of his lies hit me like a physical blow. Julian had spent the last 5 years living rent-free in a luxury condo. I paid for driving a car I leased, and wearing clothes I bought with the profits from my PR firm. He weaponized the very independence he leached off of to make himself look like a martyr, trapped with an unambitious woman. He wanted a woman who understood generational wealth. The irony was so thick it practically suffocated me. He had no idea what kind of wealth he was actually sleeping next to every night. I looked back at the stage. Julian and Victoria were posing for photos holding up champagne flutes. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for women who had lost something valuable, and I had just gained perfect crystal-clear vision. I looked down at the white orchids. I walked over to a large stainless steel trash receptacle near the elevator bank. I dropped the flowers into the garbage. Then I unzipped the leather folio, pulled out the 2 first-class boarding passes to Monaco, and let them flutter down on top of the ruined blooms. I turned my back on the celebration, walked into the waiting elevator, and pressed the button for the ground floor. My posture was perfectly straight, my head held high. By the time I reached my car in the underground parking garage, my mind was running through financial protocols with lethal precision. I sat in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and pulled out my phone. I bypassed regular contacts and dialed a heavily encrypted number. It rang twice before she answered. Nia, my best friend from our days at Spelman College, and now the most ruthless asset management lawyer in Atlanta, picked up immediately. Hey, anniversary girl, Nia said brightly. How did the big Monaco surprise go? I stared out through the windshield at the concrete wall. Nia, I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely devoid of emotion. Execute the Onyx Protocol. Burn it all down. I ended the call with Nia and tossed the phone onto the seat. The heavy thud against the leather felt like the opening strike of a gavel. I did not shed a single tear. Women with empires to protect do not cry over men who fold under the weight of their own insecurities. I grabbed my tablet from the center console and opened my private banking portal. My fingers moved with the rapid practice precision of a woman who had managed massive ledgers since she was 21 years old. First came our big joint accounts. Julian loved boasting to his fraternity brothers about our massive shared savings, always conveniently omitting that my boutique public relations firm deposited 90% of those funds. I navigated to the shared platinum checking account. The current balance was $1,200,000. With 3 swift taps, I initiated a complete sweep. I locked the account and transferred every single cent into an offshore holding trust under my maiden name. Next, I disabled the automatic deposit feature routing my monthly corporate dividends into his personal investment portfolio. For 5 years, Julian paraded around Atlanta, loudly claiming his brilliant stock market genius funded our luxurious lifestyle. Let him test that genius with a zero balance. The personal accounts were just the appetizer. Now it was time for the main course. I opened a separate, highly encrypted application on my tablet. The screen glowed deep black and gold, displaying the imposing crest of Onyx Holdings. My grandfather, Marcus Onyx, built this commercial real estate and venture capital empire from the ground up during the height of segregation. He bought up red-line districts, flipped them into thriving commercial hubs, and created immense generational wealth that totally insulated our whole powerful family from the very systems designed to keep us at the bottom. When he passed, he left the entire kingdom to me, his only granddaughter. He knew I had the steel spine required to protect our legacy. I hid my status as the sole chairman of a billion-dollar fund because I wanted a partner who loved Maya, the woman, not Maya, the bank account. Julian failed that test in the most spectacular fashion possible. I logged into the active venture capital dashboard. Sterling Cloud, the tech company Julian worshipped and Victoria supposedly built from nothing, sat right at the very top of the portfolio list. What Julian and Victoria did not know was that Victoria did not build anything. 2 years ago, when Sterling Cloud was on the verge of total bankruptcy, Onyx Holdings swooped in as an anonymous angel investor. I authorized the buyout through a labyrinth of shell companies acquiring a 74% controlling stake. Victoria was nothing more than a puppet chief executive dancing on my stage. Julian was just an employee in a house I owned. I pulled up the master investment contract. My grandfather taught me to never sign a deal without a kill switch. I scrolled down to Section 8, the Morality and Breach of Trust Clause. It was a strict stipulation demanding that the executive board maintain exemplary public conduct completely free of scandals, affairs, or any actions that could embarrass the holding company. Julian proposing to his boss in the middle of the company atrium, while legally married to the chairman of the board, was the ultimate breach. I highlighted the clause. A prompt appeared on the screen asking for final authorization to revoke funding, freeze all corporate assets, and demand immediate repayment of the entire $800 million investment. I typed in my 6-digit authorization code and hit execute. The screen flashed green. Protocol active. In less than 60 seconds, Victoria Sterling went from a celebrated tech queen to an insolvent fraud, and Julian went from an elite corporate groom to a financially ruined casualty. I tossed the tablet aside and started the engine. Just as the Maybach roared to life, my phone began to vibrate violently against the leather seat. It vibrated once, then twice, then a continuous angry buzzing that echoed through the quiet cabin of the luxury car. I glanced down at the screen. Julian. 7 missed calls. 14 missed calls. 20 missed calls. The notifications stacked up faster than the screen could refresh. I ignored the calls and opened my messaging app. Julian was firing off texts in a blind panic. I could picture him perfectly. He was likely standing at the bar of some overly expensive, pretentious restaurant in Midtown, surrounded by his sycophantic coworkers and his brand-new fiancée. He had probably ordered bottles of Dom Perignon to celebrate his newly minted high-status relationship, eager to show off his success to a woman he believed was his absolute equal. The text painted a vivid picture of a man realizing the floor had just vanished from beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. Maya, answer the phone right now. Why is my black card declining? The waiter just ran it 3 times in front of Victoria. Did you do something to the joint account? The bank app says I am locked out. Maya, this is not funny. People are staring at me. Victoria is asking what is going on. I need you to transfer $5,000 to my personal checking immediately. Do not make me ask you again. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The absolute sheer audacity of this man. He had just humiliated me in front of his entire office, proposed to another woman with a ring purchased using funds I generated, and his immediate instinct was to demand I cover his celebratory bar tab. This was the exact toxic entitlement my grandmother had warned me about when I first brought Julian home to meet the family. He always resented my independence. He hated that I went to a historically black college and built my own powerful network instead of solely relying on his shallow corporate connections. He believed my purpose was to quietly facilitate his greatness while remaining entirely invisible in his shadow. I watched the typing bubble appear and disappear on the screen as Julian frantically tried to regain control of a situation he could not possibly comprehend. He had spent years gaslighting me, telling me my boutique public relations business was a cute little hobby while he did the real work. He constantly mocked my clients, belittled my long hours, and treated my massive income as a supplemental allowance for his extravagant tastes. He genuinely believed his vice president of sales title made him the primary breadwinner. He truly believed he was the undisputed prize. Another text came through, this one dripping with the aggressive, commanding tone he used whenever he felt his fragile authority was being challenged. He hated feeling small, and right now, standing in front of Victoria with a declined card, he was microscopic. "What the hell did you do to the account? I need $5,000 right now. Unfreeze it, or I am locking you out of the house." I rested my hands on the steering wheel, admiring the flawless manicure I had gotten just for our anniversary dinner. The house he was threatening to lock me out of was entirely paid for by my trust fund. His name was only on the deed because I wanted him to feel like a true provider. Every piece of custom furniture, every imported tile, every single blade of grass in the backyard was purchased with onyx money. He was threatening to lock the queen out of her own castle. He wanted to play the role of the powerful, wealthy executive who could discard his wife for a shiny corporate upgrade. It was time for him to securely fund his own illusions. I picked up the phone, my fingers tapping out a response with cold, deliberate finality. I did not ask about Victoria. I did not ask why he betrayed our marriage vows. I did not demand an explanation for the public humiliation I had just endured. I simply addressed his arrogant financial demand with the precise level of absolute disrespect he deserved. Try paying with your elite corporate salary. I hit send, blocked his number for the exact duration of my drive home, and pulled out of the parking garage. The war had officially begun, and Julian had unknowingly brought a declined credit card to a billionaire battlefield. Granddad said wealth is quiet, but power is loud. Today I chose power. I merged onto the busy highway, the smooth acceleration of the car matching the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I thought about the look on Victoria's face when she mouthed that insult at me. She thought she had stolen a king from a peasant. She had no idea she had just stolen a parasite from a predator. The next 24 hours would fundamentally dismantle every single lie Julian had constructed to elevate himself. Sterling Cloud was completely finished forever. I pulled into the pristine driveway of the sprawling Buckhead estate I had purchased outright 3 years ago. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows, manicured hedges, and an imposing mahogany front door. Julian loved to confidently host his arrogant fraternity brothers here, pouring expensive vintage scotch and casually implying his elite corporate grind fully paid the massive monthly mortgage. I walked inside the heavy silence of the huge empty house, a stark contrast to the cheering atrium I had just left minutes ago. I bypassed the massive chef kitchen and went straight up the floating glass staircase to the master suite. I bypassed the massive closet holding his meticulously tailored suits and walked directly into my personal dressing room. I reached up and pulled down my vintage Louis Vuitton trunks. Julian had always hated them. He used to laugh whenever I packed them for my business trips, calling them cheap knockoffs I bought to look wealthy. He told his friends it was embarrassing that his wife paraded around with fake designer luggage while he wore authentic Tom Ford. He had no idea these specific trunks were authentic vintage pieces commissioned by my grandfather in Paris in the 1970s, worth more than his entire annual salary. I opened the heavy brass latches and began tossing my essentials inside. I did not need to pack everything. The house belonged to my trust, and my legal team was already filing the eviction notices. I just needed enough for a few nights at the Four Seasons, while Nia handled the messy paperwork. I folded a silk blouse and placed it inside the monogrammed canvas. The loud sound of car tires screeching onto the driveway echoed through the open window. A car door slammed with violent force. Heavy footsteps pounded against the hardwood floors downstairs. "Maya!" Julian roared, his voice echoing up the staircase. The heavy mahogany door to the master suite crashed open, hitting the wall with a loud crack. Julian stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his tie loosened, and his face twisted into a mask of absolute rage. The confident, arrogant smirk from the atrium was completely gone. In its place was the panicked desperation of a man whose financial lifeline had just been brutally severed. He marched directly into the center of the room, his expensive Italian leather shoes stomping aggressively and violently on the plush vintage Persian rug. "What the hell did you do to the bank accounts?" he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at my face. "I needed to pay for the engagement dinner. My black card declined in front of the entire executive team. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" The restaurant manager had to discreetly ask for another form of payment. I had to beg my junior sales associate to cover a $5,000 bill. I simply continued folding a soft cashmere sweater, completely refusing to look up or stop my methodical packing process. I smoothed a wrinkle from the fabric and gently placed it into the trunk. "You tried to use a card attached to my corporate account to buy champagne to celebrate your engagement to another woman?" I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Your card declined because it is no longer your account. You stole my money," Julian yelled, taking another step toward me. He grabbed the lid of the Louis Vuitton trunk and slammed it shut, narrowly missing my fingers. "You went into the app and you stole my life savings. Unfreeze those accounts right now, Maya. I am not playing games with you. You have exactly 2 minutes to put the money back, or I am calling the police and having you arrested for wire fraud. I am locking you out of this house." I slowly turned to face him, my expression utterly blank. "You absolutely cannot lock someone out of a massive house they legally own, Julian. Check the actual property deed. The monthly mortgage is fully paid through a highly secure blind trust. My private trust. You do not own a single brick of this estate." Julian scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. He began pacing the room, running a hand over his face. He was entirely incapable of accepting reality, so he fell back on the one tactic he had perfected over our 5-year marriage: gaslighting. He stopped pacing and glared at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of resentment and superiority. "This is exactly why I am leaving you," he snarled. "You are completely impossible to deal with. You are too stubborn, too independent, and you never know your place. You think because you run some little boutique public relations hustle, you are suddenly a mogul. You just plan parties, Maya. You organize catering and send out press releases. Victoria is a real chief executive officer. She manages a $1 billion tech company. She knows how to build an absolute empire." I stared at him, letting his insults wash over me without leaving a single mark. He weaponized my independence, trying to shrink me down so he could feel larger. A successful black man needs a woman who elevates his status. Julian continued, stepping closer, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "A man of my caliber needs a partner who understands the elite corporate world. Victoria speaks my language. She understands generational wealth. She brings real power to the table. You just bring headaches and fake designer luggage." He kicked the side of my vintage trunk to emphasize his point. "I need a woman who can match my ambition, Maya. You are just holding me back. Now unlock the accounts before Victoria legal team gets involved and crushes your little PR business into dust. As if sensing her cue, Julian's phone rang. He pulled it from his pocket, his angry expression instantly melting into one of deferential panic. "It is Victoria," he warned me, holding up a finger. "Do not say a single word." He answered the call and immediately put it on speakerphone, clearly intending to use his new fiancée to intimidate me into submission. "Julian, darling." Victoria sharp, commanding voice filled the bedroom. "Is the issue with your bank resolved? The board members are waiting for us at the celebration dinner, and it looks terrible that you had to leave your own engagement party to deal with a banking error." "Victoria, my love," Julian answered, his tone sickeningly sweet. "I am handling it right now. Maya is just throwing a tantrum because she found out about us. She temporarily locked the shared accounts out of spite." I heard Victoria let out a long, dramatic sigh of extreme disappointment over the speakerphone. "Maya, if you are listening, please stop acting like a petulant child," Victoria sneered, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "Julian has outgrown you. It happens. You need to sign the divorce papers quietly and walk away. If you try to fight us for his assets, or if you do not restore his bank access immediately, I will personally direct Sterling Cloud Corporate Legal Division to bankrupt your little public relations company. We have lawyers on retainer who cost more per hour than you make in a year. Take whatever pocket change you have and leave Julian alone, or I promise you, I will make your life a living nightmare." I did not speak. I simply smiled, a cold, predatory smile that made Julian take a slight step backward. Suddenly, the background noise on the speakerphone changed. The polite chatter of the executive dinner vanished, replaced by the sound of rapid, panicked footsteps and slamming doors. "Victoria," a frantic, breathless male voice shouted through the phone connection. It was David, the chief financial officer of Sterling Cloud. "Victoria, you need to get back to the office right now." Victoria's tone shifted from arrogant to highly irritated. "David, I am at my engagement dinner. Whatever this is, it can wait until Monday morning. It absolutely cannot wait!" David screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror. "We are completely insolvent." Victoria Onyx Holdings just pulled their entire backing. They executed a breach of trust clause. They revoked the $800 million investment. The funds are gone. The accounts are frozen. The Securities and Exchange Commission is already calling the legal department. "We are going bankrupt." The line went dead silent. The warm blood instantly drained completely from Julian's stunned face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified white ghost. His phone slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. I reached down, grabbed the handles of my authentic vintage Louis Vuitton trunks, and effortlessly pulled them toward the bedroom door. I paused right next to Julian, who was currently hyperventilating, staring blankly at his dropped phone. I smiled again, adjusted the collar of my blazer, and walked out the door, leaving him standing alone in the wreckage of his own illusions. The heavy oak door of the master suite clicked shut behind me with a satisfying finality. I left Julian standing there with his shattered corporate dreams and walked down the floating glass staircase of the Buckhead estate for the last time. My driver was already waiting in the driveway to take me to the Four Seasons. I spent the night sipping sparkling water and watching the city lights completely undisturbed by the frantic messages flooding my blocked phone log. The next morning, the sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel suite when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced at the screen and saw my mother-in-law, Brenda, calling. I let it ring a few times before answering. "Maya." Baby Brenda said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet southern drawl that she only used when she wanted something. "I have been crying all morning. Julian came over last night and told me everything. My heart is just broken for you two." I kept my voice perfectly level. "Is that so, Brenda?" "Yes, it is," she insisted, ramping up the maternal concern. "Marriage is sacred, Maya. The devil is just busy right now trying to tear down a beautiful black household. I need you to come over for Sunday dinner after church today. Just you and me and Julian. We are going to sit down, break bread, and pray on this marriage. We can fix this if we just let the Lord work. I knew exactly what this was. It was a trap. Julian had run straight to his mother the moment he realized his financial lifeline was severed. Brenda had always been his ultimate shield, the woman who coddled his mediocrity and blamed the world for his failures. She wanted me in her house so she could pressure me into unfreezing the accounts before Monday morning. But a predator does not hide from a trap. A predator walks right into it and breaks the mechanism. I will be there at 2 o'clock, I said, and ended the call. I took my time getting ready. I did not wear the conservative pastel dresses Brenda always hinted I should wear to church. Instead, I wore a sharp, tailored emerald green suit. I left my natural hair in a full, voluminous afro. Julian had always begged me to press it straight for his corporate dinners, claiming natural hair did not look wealthy enough for his colleagues. Today I wanted every inch of my power on display. I pulled my Range Rover up to Brenda House precisely at 2. It was a beautiful brick home, in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. A home I mentally noted whose mortgage was conveniently auto-paid from my corporate accounts. I walked up the pathway, the scent of pot roast and collard greens drifting through the screen door. I turned the brass knob and stepped into the foyer. The house was quiet, too quiet. I walked into the formal dining room and stopped. It was a complete setup. Brenda was sitting at the head of the dark cherry wood table. Julian was seated to her right. Beside him, looking entirely out of place in a suburban dining room, sat Victoria Sterling. On the left side of the table sat Julian's sister Chloe, furiously typing on her phone, and Chloe, husband Darnell, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed over his chest. The sweet praying mother routine vanished the second I walked into the room. Brenda's face hardened into a scowl of intense disapproval. "Look who finally decided to show up," Chloe muttered, rolling her eyes and setting her phone face down on the table. I stood at the head of the table, perfectly composed. "I thought we were praying on the marriage, Brenda," I said, my gaze sweeping over the uninvited guests. "I did not realize you invited the mistress to the prayer circle." Victoria let out a sharp, aristocratic scoff. "Please, Maya," she sneered, adjusting the massive diamond ring on her finger. "Do not use such vulgar terms. Julian and I have a partnership, something you clearly never understood how to build." Brenda slammed her palm flat against the table. "Do not speak to my guests that way. Maya," she barked, her voice losing every ounce of its fake southern charm. "Victoria is sitting here because she is part of Julian's future. You are sitting here because you need to understand your role as a black woman in this family." I raised an eyebrow, refusing to sit down. "My role." "Yes, your role," Brenda declared, standing up to face me. "You took vows, Maya, for better or for worse. But the second things get a little hard. The second my son makes a mistake, you try to destroy him. You locked him out of his own bank accounts. You humiliated him. A strong black woman does not tear her man down. She builds him up. She endures. She forgives. That is how we keep our families together. You want me to endure my husband proposing to another woman on a stage?" I asked, my voice completely steady. Julian scoffed, shaking his head. He looked at his mother like he was a wounded victim. "See, Mom? This is what I was talking about. She is so defensive." Brenda pointed a finger at me. "You drove him to this, Maya. Look at you. You walk in here looking like you are ready to go to a club instead of a Sunday dinner. You insist on wearing your hair in that wild, unprofessional style instead of looking polished. Julian works in an elite corporate environment. He needs a woman who looks the part." She gestured toward Victoria, who was sitting perfectly straight, wearing a sleek cashmere sweater and a smooth blowout. "Victoria comes from a pedigree. She knows how to elevate a man. You just want to fight him for control because you make a little bit of money throwing parties. My PR firm paid off your second mortgage, Brenda." I said the truth, cutting through the air like a knife. Chloe slammed her hands on the table and jumped up. "Do not disrespect our mother. You think you are so much better than us because you have some cash. Julian told us what you did. You stole his money, you drained the joint accounts and locked him out like a common thief." "I did not steal anything," I replied, maintaining my icy composure. "I secured my own assets." Victoria let out a patronizing laugh. Assets, she echoed, shaking her head. Maya, you are embarrassing yourself. Julian was the one pulling in the massive bonuses. We all know Sterling Cloud funded your lifestyle, and honestly, considering what happened to my company yesterday, I am starting to think you might be involved in corporate sabotage. We will be looking into that, by the way. The sheer delusion in the room was suffocating. Julian had fed them a narrative where he was the millionaire mastermind, and I was the bitter, erratic wife trying to steal his hard-earned fortune. He had not told them about the phone call he received in the bedroom. He had not told them Sterling Cloud was currently drowning because Onyx Holdings pulled its venture capital. He was still playing the role of the rich executive, hoping he could force me to unfreeze the money before his entire family realized he was completely broke. Darnell, who had been sitting quietly with his arms crossed, suddenly pushed his chair back. The wood scraped loudly against the floor. He stood up, towering over the table. He was a large man who relied heavily on physical intimidation to get his way. He walked around the table and stopped just inches away from me, trying to force me to step back. I did not move a single muscle. Listen to me very closely, Maya, Darnell said, his voice dropping to a low, aggressive growl. You are going to take your phone out right now and you are going to unfreeze Julian money. You are not going to leave this house until his bank access is fully restored. I looked Darnell dead in the eye. Or what? Or things are going to get extremely difficult for you, he threatened, stepping even closer. You think you can just walk in here, disrespect my mother-in-law, steal from my brother-in-law, and walk out? You owe this family. In fact, since you want to play games with his bank accounts, you are going to hand over the keys to that Range Rover sitting in the driveway. Consider it emotional compensation for the stress you are putting Julian through. He needs a vehicle that reflects his executive status while this gets sorted out. I looked at Julian. He was sitting back in his chair, a smug, satisfied grin spreading across his face. He loved this. He loved hiding behind his family while they did his dirty work. He thought bullying me in a group would force me to submit. You want my car keys? I asked, keeping my tone deadly calm. Yes, Darnell demanded, holding his hand out, palm up. Hand them over. Now. Chloe pulled her phone out of her pocket and held it up, her thumb hovering over the screen. If you do not give him the keys and unfreeze the accounts right now, I am calling the police. She threatened, her voice shrill with fake righteous anger. I will tell them you stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from my brother. Wire fraud is a federal crime, Maya. You will go to jail. We will see how strong and independent you act when you are sitting in a prison cell. Brenda crossed her arms, looking at me with total disdain. You brought this on yourself, Maya. Just do what Darnell says. Hand over the keys, fix the bank accounts, and sign the divorce papers Victoria brought. If you do that, we will let you walk out of here quietly. We are offering you grace. Take it. I stood completely surrounded by a family of arrogant, entitled parasites who genuinely believed they had me trapped. They thought they held all the power. They thought they held all the leverage. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet belonged entirely to me. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact with Darnell. The sheer audacity of this man standing in a house I paid for, demanding the keys to a vehicle I bought, was a masterclass in delusional entitlement. I slowly lowered my gaze to his outstretched hand, then looked back up at his face. A slow, chilling smile spread across my lips. The silence in the dining room became heavy, suffocating, thick with the scent of roasted meat and simmering resentment. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between me and Darnell, cowardice radiating from his every pore. He loved playing the powerful patriarch, but he always hid behind his family's aggression when faced with actual conflict. I reached into my structured leather tote bag. Darnell smirked clearly, believing I was retrieving the heavy set of car keys. Chloe let out a triumphant scoff, tossing her hair over her shoulder, ready to witness my complete surrender. Instead of keys, my fingers wrapped around the cold, sleek aluminum edge of my iPad Pro. I pulled it out and stepped forward, closing the distance Darnell had tried to establish. He instinctively took a half step back as I bypassed him entirely. I walked right up to the dark cherry wood dining table right in front of Brenda and placed the tablet flat on the surface, pushing aside a crystal bowl of her famous sweet potatoes to make room. "What is this nonsense?" Brenda snapped, glaring down at the device. "We are not looking at your little party planning spreadsheets, Maya. Darnell told you to hand over the keys." I ignored her entirely and tapped the screen, unlocking the device. I opened the master financial ledger. I did not pull up the Onyx Holdings dashboard. I did not need to deploy a billionaire-level nuclear strike for this specific skirmish. The standard corporate accounts for my public relations firm would provide more than enough ammunition to completely decimate this table. I turned the bright screen toward Brenda. "You talk a lot about keeping a black family together, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. "You talk about Julian being an elite corporate provider. You talk about my role. Let us take a very close look at exactly what my role has been for the past 5 years." I tapped the screen, opening a specific property deed and its corresponding payment history. "Look at the screen, Brenda. 3 years ago, when Julian got his vice president promotion, he came to this very table and told you he was buying this house for his mama. He told you his elite corporate grind was retiring you early." I watched Brenda's eyes drop to the screen. The glowing white light illuminated the sudden confusion on her face. Her eyes scanned the document, searching for her son's name. "That is the deed to this house." I continued, my finger tapping the digital document. "And right beneath it is the bank routing number that pays your massive monthly mortgage. Read the name on the account, Brenda. Read it out loud for the entire table." Brenda opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Julian, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. "Since you suddenly cannot read, I will read it for you," I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Maya Onyx Public Relations. My cute little PR hustle has paid every single cent of your mortgage for 36 straight months. Julian has not contributed a single dime to the roof over your head. You are sitting in a house secured entirely by my sweat, my network, and my money." "That is a lie," Chloe shouted, leaning across the table to look at the screen. "Julian makes incredible money. He pays for this. You are manipulating the documents. You forged this." I swiped the screen with a swift, aggressive motion, pulling up a completely different ledger. I turned the iPad slightly so Chloe had a perfect view. "Since you want to be loud, Chloe, let us discuss your incredible hustle. You spend all day on social media posting about being a self-made boss, claiming your luxury lifestyle is self-funded. Look at this ledger." Chloe's eyes went wide as she recognized the logo of the elite private academy her 2 children attended. I highlighted the automatic monthly drafts. "Your kids attend the most exclusive private school in the state," I said, staring directly into her panicked eyes. "Tuition is $40,000 a year per child. Julian told you he was covering it as an investment in his nieces. He lied. I am covering it. Every single tuition payment, every uniform fee, every ridiculous fundraising gala donation comes directly from my corporate accounts. You are a boss on the internet, but in reality, you are a charity case completely dependent on the sister-in-law you just threatened to send to prison." Chloe staggered back, bumping into the dining room wall, her mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. She looked at Darnell for support, but Darnell was staring at the tablet, his aggressive posturing completely forgotten. I turned my attention to him, my gaze sweeping him from head to toe with absolute disgust. I reached over and tapped the screen one final time, bringing up an automotive lease agreement. "You want the keys to my Range Rover, Darnell?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. "You want emotional compensation." I tapped the lease document on the screen. "This is the lease for that brand new Mercedes AMG you parked in the driveway, the car you drive around the city pretending you are a successful entrepreneur. Look at the guarantor on the lease, Darnell." He stared at the screen, his chest rising and falling heavily. The name Maya Onyx stared back at him in bold black letters. "You do not even own the leather seats you sit on," I told him, stepping right into his personal space, watching him shrink. "You demand my car keys while driving a vehicle I finance. You are nothing but a dependent riding on the coattails of your wife's brother's wife. Do not ever step to me again and demand a single thing you did not earn." The room was paralyzed. The entire foundation of their arrogant, entitled existence had just been ripped out from underneath them. Julian had spent years building a fictional empire using my actual wealth to buy the admiration and respect of his family. He let them disrespect me, belittle my business, and insult my appearance, all while allowing them to feast on the fruits of my labor. He bought their love with my money. "Julian, say something," Brenda pleaded, looking at her son with desperate, tear-filled eyes. "Tell her she is lying. Tell us this is fake." Julian said absolutely nothing. He stared at his plate, thoroughly humiliated in front of his family, and more importantly, in front of Victoria. Victoria was looking at Julian with a mixture of shock and sheer revulsion, slowly realizing the man she thought was a corporate titan was actually a fraudulent parasite. Maya put the tablet away. Julian finally choked out his voice, a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Please, we can talk about this privately. Just put it away." "I am done talking, Julian," I said. I looked around the table at the faces of the people who had just tried to bully, insult, and threaten me into submission. They weaponized my culture, insulted my hair, and demanded my surrender. Now they were going to learn the true cost of their disrespect. I reached down to the iPad and navigated to the active authorization portal. I selected Brenda mortgage account. I selected Chloe tuition portal. I selected Darnell vehicle lease. Lease canceled, tuition revoked, mortgage autopay disabled. I looked at Julian one last time. "It is time for you to actually be the provider you claim to be. Provide for them, Julian." I hit the execute button. The screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving green. The digital confirmation sliced through the silence. The family erupted into absolute chaos. Phones began buzzing and pinging almost immediately as automated cancellation emails hit their inboxes. Darnell pulled his phone from his pocket, reading the lease termination notice, his face turning an angry, mottled red. Chloe began hyperventilating, staring at a notification from the private academy regarding a failed payment method. Brenda completely lost her mind. She lunged across the dining table, knocking over crystal water glasses and sending silverware crashing to the floor. "You vindictive witch!" she screamed, her arms flailing as she tried to reach me. "You are destroying this family! You are ruining my son!" Julian jumped up and grabbed his mother by the shoulders, pulling her back before she could reach me. "Mom, stop!" he yelled, struggling to restrain her. "Just stop!" Victoria, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly stood up. She smoothed the front of her cashmere sweater, her face twisting into a mask of elitist disgust. She looked around the chaotic dining room, viewing the screaming and fighting as beneath her. She clearly believed she could simply buy her way out of this messy ghetto situation and rescue her man. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. She grabbed a pen and hastily scribbled across the paper, her movements sharp and arrogant. She tore the check from the book and tossed it across the table. It landed right next to my iPad. "Take my pocket change and leave Julian alone." Victoria sneered, looking down her nose at me. "That is $50,000. That should cover whatever petty expenses you think you are owed. Now take it, get out of this house, and go back to whatever mediocre life you lived before you tricked Julian into marrying you." I looked down at the check. It was written perfectly, $50,000. But my eyes immediately locked onto the account routing information printed at the bottom. It was drawn from the primary corporate operational account of Sterling Cloud, the exact same corporate account that was currently imploding because Onyx Holdings had frozen all assets less than 24 hours ago. Victoria was so arrogant, so deeply insulated in her own bubble of false superiority that she had not yet realized David, the CFO, was entirely correct. She was writing checks from a dead bank account. She was completely broke, and she did not even know it yet. I reached down and picked up the check. I held the crisp paper between my manicured fingers, letting the silence stretch out as Victoria waited for me to grovel and walk away. I looked her directly in the eyes. I grabbed the edges of the paper and ripped the $50,000 check neatly in half. Victoria gasped, her aristocratic composure completely shattering. "What are you doing?" she demanded. I placed the two halves together and ripped them again, turning the massive payout into worthless quarters. I held my hand over the center of the table and opened my fingers. The torn pieces of the check fluttered down like confetti, landing directly onto Brenda perfectly glazed Sunday pot roast. "Keep it," I said, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality. "You are going to need it for the bankruptcy lawyers." I picked up my iPad, dropped it into my leather tote, turned my back on the screaming, panicked room, and walked out the front door. The cool Sunday air hit my face refreshing and clean. I climbed into my Range Rover, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the parasites to feed on each other. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact with Darnell for a second. The sheer audacity of this man standing in a house I paid for, demanding the keys to a vehicle I bought, was a masterclass in delusional entitlement. I slowly lowered my gaze to his outstretched hand, then looked back up at his face. A slow, chilling smile spread across my lips. The silence in the dining room became heavy, suffocating thick with the scent of roasted meat and simmering resentment. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between me and Darnell, cowardice radiating from his every pore. He loved playing the role of the powerful patriarch, but he always hid behind his family aggression when faced with actual conflict. I reached into my structured leather tote bag. Darnell smirked, clearly believing I was retrieving the heavy set of car keys. Chloe let out a loud, triumphant scoff, tossing her hair over her shoulder, ready to witness my complete surrender. Instead of keys, my fingers wrapped tightly around the cold, sleek aluminum edge of my brand new iPad. I pulled it out and stepped forward, closing the distance Darnell had tried to establish. He instinctively took a half step back as I bypassed him entirely. I walked right up to the dark cherry wood dining table right in front of Brenda and carefully placed the digital tablet flat on the surface, pushing aside a crystal bowl of her famous sweet potatoes to make room. "What is this nonsense?" Brenda snapped, glaring down at the device. "We are not looking at your little party planning spreadsheets, Maya. Darnell told you to hand over the keys." I ignored her entirely and tapped the screen, unlocking the device. I opened the master financial ledger. I did not pull up the Onyx Holdings dashboard. I did not need to deploy a billionaire-level nuclear strike for this specific skirmish. The standard corporate accounts for my public relations firm would provide more than enough ammunition to completely decimate this table. I turned the very bright screen right toward Brenda. "You talk a lot about keeping a black family together, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through the thick tension with sharp surgical precision. "You talk about Julian being an elite corporate provider. You talk about my role. Let us take a very close look at exactly what my role has been for the past 5 years. I tapped the screen, opening a specific property deed and its corresponding payment history. Look at the screen, Brenda. 3 years ago, when Julian got his vice president promotion, he came to this very table and told you he was buying this house for his mama. He boldly told you his elite corporate grind was retiring you early." I quietly watched Brenda, eyes drop to the screen. The bright, glowing white light illuminated the sudden confusion on her face. Her eyes quickly scanned the legal documents, desperately searching for her son name. "That is the deed to this house." I continued, my finger tapping the digital document. "And right beneath it is the bank routing number that pays your massive monthly mortgage. Read the name on the account, Brenda. Read it out loud for the entire table." Brenda opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Julian, who was suddenly gripping the wooden edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He literally looked like he was going to be physically sick. "Since you suddenly cannot read, I will read it for you," I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Maya Onyx Public Relations. My cute little PR hustle has personally paid every single cent of your mortgage for 36 straight months. Julian has not contributed a single dime to the roof over your head. You are sitting in a massive house secured entirely by my sweat, my professional network, and my money." "That is an absolute lie," Chloe shouted, leaning across the table to look at the screen. "Julian makes incredible money. He pays for this. You are manipulating the documents. You blindly forged this. I swiped the screen with a swift, aggressive motion, pulling up a completely different ledger. I turned the iPad slightly so Chloe had a perfect view. Since you want to be loud, Chloe, let us discuss your incredible hustle. You spend all day on social media posting about being a self-made boss, claiming your luxury lifestyle is self-funded. Look at this specific ledger. Chloe's eyes went wide as she clearly recognized the logo of the elite private academy her two children attended. I highlighted the automatic monthly drafts. Your two kids attend the most exclusive private school in the state, I said, staring directly into her panicked eyes. Tuition is $40,000 a year per child. Julian told you he was covering it as an investment in his nieces. He blatantly lied. I am fully covering it. Every single tuition payment, every uniform fee, every ridiculous fundraising gala donation comes directly from my corporate accounts. You are a boss on the internet, but in reality, you are a charity case completely dependent on the sister-in-law you just threatened to send to prison. Chloe staggered back, heavily bumping hard into the dining room wall, her mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. She quickly looked at Darnell for support, but Darnell was staring at the tablet, his aggressive posturing completely forgotten. I immediately turned my full attention to him, my gaze sweeping him from head to toe with absolute disgust. I reached over and tapped the screen one final time, bringing up an automotive lease agreement. You want the keys to my Range Rover, Darnell? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet register. You really want emotional compensation. I tapped the lease document on the screen. This is the lease for that brand new Mercedes-AMG you parked in the driveway. The expensive car you drive around the city pretending you are a successful entrepreneur. Look at the guarantor on the lease, Darnell. He stared intensely at the screen, his broad chest rising and falling heavily. The name Maya Onyx stared back at him in bold, dark black letters. You do not even own the leather seats you sit on, I told him, stepping right into his personal space, watching him shrink. You demand my car keys while driving a vehicle I finance. You are nothing but a dependent riding on the coattails of your wife, brother-wife. Do not ever step to me again and demand a single thing you did not earn. The room was completely paralyzed. The entire foundation of their arrogant, entitled existence had just been ripped out from underneath them. Julian had spent years building a fictional empire, using my actual wealth to buy the admiration and respect of his family. He callously let them disrespect me, belittle my business, and insult my appearance, all while allowing them to feast on the fruits of my labor. He literally bought their love with my hard-earned money. Julian, say something, Brenda pleaded, looking at her son with desperate, tear-filled eyes. Tell her she is lying. Tell us this is fake. Julian said absolutely nothing. He stared at his plate, thoroughly humiliated in front of his family, and more importantly, in front of Victoria. Victoria was looking at Julian with a mixture of shock and sheer revulsion, slowly realizing the man she thought was a corporate titan was actually a fraudulent parasite. Maya put the tablet away. Julian finally choked out his voice, a pathetic, trembling whisper. Please, we can talk about this privately. Just put it away. I am done talking. Julian, I said. I looked around the table at the faces of the people who had just tried to bully, insult, and threaten me into submission. They weaponized my culture, insulted my hair, and demanded my surrender. Now they were going to learn the true cost of their disrespect. I reached down to the iPad and navigated to the active authorization portal. I selected Brenda mortgage account. I selected Chloe tuition portal. I selected Darnell vehicle lease. Lease canceled. Tuition revoked. Mortgage autopay disabled. I looked at Julian one last time. It is time for you to actually be the provider you claim to be. Provide for them, Julian. I hit the execute button. The screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving green. The digital confirmation sliced through the silence. The entire family instantly erupted into absolute chaos around the dark cherry wood table. Brenda suddenly lunged at me, screaming wildly with her arms flailing in the air. Victoria scoffed, tossing a $50,000 check across the table. "Take my pocket change and leave Julian alone," she sneered. I calmly ripped the check in half, letting it fall onto Brenda's Sunday roast. "Keep it. You are going to need it for the bankruptcy lawyers." As the absolute 74% majority shareholder of Sterling Cloud, my access to the company infrastructure was completely unrestricted. Through the labyrinth of anonymous shell companies that shielded Onyx Holdings, I maintained master administrative control over the entire Sterling Tower network, including the executive suite security feeds. I sat comfortably in the plush leather chair of my hotel suite, sipping a freshly brewed espresso, and opened my encrypted laptop. I accessed the live audio and video feed from the Chief Executive Officer suite. The glorious corporate meltdown was unfolding exactly as I had orchestrated. Victoria was pacing frantically across her massive office, her luxury stilettos clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. She was no longer the composed, arrogant elitist who had thrown a worthless check at me the day before. Her sleek blowout was ruined, her hands aggressively pulling at the roots of her hair. David, the chief financial officer, stood near the door, clutching a tablet to his chest like a physical shield. His face was covered in a cold, terrified sweat. "We are in total freefall, Victoria," David said, his voice trembling with sheer panic. The news about Onyx Holdings pulling their $800 million backing leaked to the financial press this morning. Our secondary investors are actively jumping ship. Two of our biggest venture capital partners just liquidated their shares at a massive loss. We do not have the liquid cash to make Friday payroll. The server hosts are threatening to shut down our primary data centers by midnight if we do not wire the outstanding balance. "Fix it!" Victoria screamed, slamming her hands flat onto her expensive glass desk. "You are the financial officer, David. Move funds around. Liquidate the secondary accounts. Do whatever you have to do to keep the lights on." "There are no secondary accounts," David fired back, his voice rising in desperation. "Onyx Holdings was our entire lifeline. They owned 3/4 of the board voting power. When they executed the breach of trust clause, they instantly froze all accessible credit lines. We are entirely insolvent." Victoria let out a guttural scream of frustration and hurled a crystal paperweight across the room. It shattered loudly against the pristine white wall. "Get me the chairman of Onyx," she ordered, pointing an aggressive finger at David. "I do not care if you have to bribe someone, threaten someone, or fly to their corporate headquarters and beg on your knees. I need a direct face-to-face meeting with the anonymous chairman of Onyx Holdings by tomorrow morning. I can charm them. I can fix this. I just need to get in the room with whoever runs that fund." Julian was standing awkwardly in the corner of the office, trying to make himself look useful while essentially serving as highly paid background decoration. He hated feeling small, and right now, watching his new fiancée empire crumble to dust around him, he was microscopic. His massive ego simply could not handle being a helpless bystander. He needed to prove his elite corporate worth to Victoria. He needed to be the hero who saved the day. "Victoria, listen to me," Julian interjected, stepping forward and using the deep, commanding tone he usually reserved for his junior sales associates. "We are going to get through this. You just need a quick cash injection to tie the company over until you meet with the Onyx chairman. I know exactly where we can get it." Victoria whipped around and glared at him, her eyes burning with impatient fury. "From where, Julian? Your bank accounts are frozen. Your credit cards are declining. You could not even pay for a Sunday pot roast yesterday." Julian swallowed hard, visibly wincing at the reminder of his utter humiliation. "From Maya," he stated, his voice filled with arrogant certainty. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, raising a curious eyebrow. "She is hiding money," Julian continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "She always has been. She pretends her boutique public relations firm is just a cute little hobby, but I know she pulls in way more revenue than she claims. She has a secret safety net, Victoria. She drained our joint accounts and stole my life savings. She is sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe even millions, tucked away in offshore accounts." Victoria narrowed her eyes, the desperation making her receptive to his delusional theory. "What are you suggesting, Julian?" "We deploy your corporate legal team," Julian said, a wicked, vindictive smile spreading across his face. We use Sterling Cloud ruthless corporate sharks to completely destroy her. We sue Maya for spousal support and emotional damages. We claim she committed felony wire fraud when she moved the joint funds. We instruct the lawyers to draft a devastating, aggressive lawsuit threatening to seize her entire public relations firm and throw her in federal prison for financial fraud. We bleed her dry. She will panic and settle out of court instantly to avoid jail time. We can take everything she has, and you can use that cash to stabilize Sterling Cloud. Victoria stared at Julian for a long moment. Slowly, a predatory, arrogant smirk replaced her panicked expression. "Do it," she commanded. "Call the legal department right now. Tell them to draft the most aggressive lawsuit they have ever written. I want her completely ruined by sunset." I closed my laptop and let out a genuine, joyful laugh that echoed through the quiet hotel suite. The sheer stupidity of their arrogant plot was almost too perfect. Julian genuinely believed his status as a man entitled him to my hard-earned wealth, and he was perfectly willing to weaponize his mistress' legal team to steal it. He wanted to play a high-stakes legal game of chess against a woman who literally owned the board. I grabbed my leather tote bag and headed downstairs to my waiting car. It was time to visit my attorney. Nia's office was located in the penthouse suite of a sleek, ultra-modern glass tower in downtown Atlanta. The interior was decorated in sharp, aggressive tones of black and chrome, a perfect reflection of her ruthless legal reputation. Nia was not just my attorney. She was my closest confidant and the only other person on the planet who knew I was the sole chairman of Onyx Holdings. I walked into her spacious corner office and sat in the plush leather chair opposite her desk. Nia was already reviewing the eviction filings for Brenda, Chloe, and Darnell. "The local sheriff is serving the eviction notices to your in-laws tomorrow morning," Nia said without looking up from her dual monitors. "They have exactly 48 hours to vacate the Buckhead estate before they are forcibly removed for trespassing. I also sent a formal cease and desist to Darnell regarding the Range Rover." "Excellent," I replied, crossing my legs. "But we have a much bigger situation unfolding. Julian and Victoria are planning to sue me." Nia paused typing and looked up, her perfectly arched eyebrows raising in sheer amusement. "On what possible grounds?" "Julian has convinced Victoria that I have a massive secret safety net hidden within my public relations firm," I explained. "He wants to sue me for spousal support, seize my company, and threaten me with federal wire fraud for moving my own money. He thinks Victoria corporate lawyers will intimidate me into a quick cash settlement so they can temporarily save Sterling Cloud from the bankruptcy I initiated." Nia let out a rich, throaty laugh and leaned back in her chair. "That is the most incredibly delusional strategy I have ever heard. They are bringing a water gun to a drone strike." Just as she finished speaking, the heavy glass door to her office swung open. The receptionist walked in, looking slightly flustered, followed closely by a stern-looking man holding a thick manila envelope. "Excuse me, Ms. Nia," the receptionist said. "This gentleman insisted he had an urgent delivery for Maya Onyx." The process server stepped forward and dropped the heavy envelope directly onto the glass coffee table between me and Nia. "You have been served," he stated bluntly, turning on his heel and walking out of the office. Nia reached over and picked up the thick stack of legal documents. She adjusted her designer glasses and began scanning the first few pages. Her expression immediately shifted into total professional focus. "Well, you were absolutely right," Nia murmured quickly, flipping through the aggressive legal jargon. "They are throwing everything at the wall. Julian is officially filing for divorce. He is demanding full emergency spousal support. He wants permanent possession of the Buckhead estate. He is demanding the Range Rover. He is petitioning for full ownership of your public relations firm, claiming his corporate status was the primary factor in your business success. And he is alleging felony financial fraud regarding the joint bank accounts." I simply smiled, admiring the flawless view of the Atlanta skyline through the massive windows. The audacity of average men will never cease to amaze me. Nia continued reading, flipping toward the back of the massive legal document. Suddenly, she stopped. She read a specific paragraph twice, her eyes widening behind her frames. She slowly lowered the document, a look of sheer, unrestrained disbelief spreading across her face. Maya Nia said, her voice trembling with the effort to hold back a burst of laughter. You are not going to believe what these idiot corporate lawyers just did. What did they do, Nia? I asked. In their desperate attempt to locate your so-called secret safety net, Julian attorneys filed aggressive discovery motions, Nia explained, holding the paper up. They noticed some large, irregular financial transfers linked to your accounts over the past few years. They assume you are hiding your personal wealth in a corporate shell company. Nia could no longer contain her amusement. She burst out laughing, slamming the legal document down onto her desk. They just subpoenaed the master financial records of Onyx Holdings. A sharp predatory thrill coursed through my entire body. They subpoenaed my billionaire holding company. They demanded the financial records of the exact venture capital firm that was currently executing their total bankruptcy. They had unknowingly demanded the unmasking of the very entity that held their entire pathetic lives in the palm of its hand. They dug their own graves. Julian Lawyer is demanding the anonymous chairman of Onyx Holdings appear for a deposition to explain their financial relationship with you, Nia said, wiping a tear of laughter from her eye. They think they caught you. They think the chairman is your secret accomplice. Julian Lawyer had explicitly stated they were going to bury me as soon as Victoria met with the chairman to restore their $800 million funding. They were relying on a phantom savior to rescue them from a ghost they had just subpoenaed. I stood up slowly, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my tailored emerald blazer. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the bustling city below. I thought about the sheer arrogance on Victoria's face when she tossed that worthless check. I thought about the cowardly entitlement Julian displayed when he demanded my wealth to fund his infidelity. They wanted a meeting with the chairman of Onyx Holdings. They demanded a deposition to uncover the truth. I turned back to Nia, my smile radiating cold, absolute power. Confirm the meeting for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I instructed her. I will make sure the chairman is right on time. The sun breached the Atlanta skyline at precisely 8 o'clock the next morning, casting long golden shadows across the glass facade of the Sterling Tower. Inside her sprawling penthouse, Victoria stood before a full-length antique mirror, fastening a heavy pearl necklace around her throat. She was treating this morning not as a desperate plea for financial rescue, but as a coronation. She wore a pristine white tailored dress suit, the physical embodiment of old money confidence. Beside her, Julian adjusted the silk tie of his Tom Ford suit, checking his reflection with a smug, satisfied grin. He felt like a king. Today was the day he officially ascended. Victoria had promised him the co-chief executive officer title the exact moment the Onyx Holdings funds were restored. He believed with absolute certainty that his charm combined with Victoria's pedigree would easily manipulate the anonymous chairman into reopening the financial floodgates. The impending lawsuit against his soon-to-be ex-wife was just the cherry on top, a final act of dominance to erase the humiliation he suffered at his mother's dining room table. Down in the cavernous, marble-lined lobby of the Sterling Tower, the delusion was actively metastasizing. Brenda, Chloe, and Darnell were camped out near the gold-plated elevator banks, forming a ridiculous tableau of unearned triumph. Brenda was holding a massive bouquet of silver and gold mylar balloons, printed with the word, "Congratulations," in bold, cursive lettering. Chloe was busy taking selfies in front of the corporate logo, her designer knockoff bag positioned perfectly for her internet followers. Darnell leaned against a marble pillar, sipping a coffee he had undoubtedly charged to one of Julian's rapidly dying credit cards. They had received Julian's panicked but arrogant text message the night before, assuring them that Victoria was securing a billion-dollar deal this morning, and his position at the top of the corporate food chain was guaranteed. They were completely oblivious to the eviction notices currently being processed for the Buckhead estate. They were oblivious to the fact that their entire financial ecosystem was bleeding out. They were simply waiting to cheer for the son who had promised them the world using another woman's checkbook. Across town, my own morning routine was a drastically different affair. For 5 years, I had carefully curated an image of modest, supportive, suburban domesticity. I wore pastel colors, sensible heels, and understated jewelry to make Julian feel masculine and superior. I kept my natural hair pressed straight to appease his mother's archaic respectability politics. I shrank my entire existence so his fragile ego could expand. That era was officially dead and buried. I stood in the center of my master closet, completely shedding the disguise. Today required armor. I bypassed the conservative racks and pulled out a bespoke, double-breasted Alexander McQueen suit in a striking, vibrant shade of crimson. It was tailored to absolute perfection, projecting an aura of lethal, unapologetic authority. I paired it with a black silk camisole, and my signature Christian Louboutin stiletto pumps the red soles perfectly, matching the sharp lines of the suit. I left my hair in a massive, glorious, unbothered natural crown. I did not reach for the delicate gold chains Julian preferred. Instead, I opened the hidden velvet-lined safe at the back of the closet. I pulled out a vintage, heavy diamond collar necklace and matching tennis bracelet pieces that had been locked away in darkness for half a decade. The cold, brilliant stones rested against my collarbone, catching the morning light and throwing prisms across the room. I looked at my reflection. There was no trace of the submissive wife who quietly managed spreadsheets in the background. The woman staring back at me was the apex predator Julian and his family had blindly decided to hunt. I grabbed my leather briefcase and walked out to the driveway. My personal driver, Marcus, was standing at attention beside a pristine midnight black Mercedes Maybach. He opened the rear door, his face impassive, but his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the shift in my demeanor. I slid into the opulent leather-scented interior. Nia was already sitting in the back seat, nursing a black coffee and reviewing a thick stack of printed briefs. She looked up as I settled into the plush seat, her eyes sweeping over my crimson suit and the heavy diamonds resting against my skin. She let out a low, appreciative whistle. "The chairman has officially entered the chat." I smoothed the crease of my trousers as the Maybach glided smoothly away from the curb and merged onto the highway. "I am done playing the supporting character in a life I entirely finance," I stated, looking out the tinted window at the passing city. Nia tapped her pen against her chin. "You know, I have always wondered why you went through such elaborate lengths to hide the scope of Onyx Holdings from him. You built a fortress of shell companies and blind trusts just to keep your own husband in the dark. It seemed like an exhausting way to live." I kept my gaze fixed on the skyline growing larger in the distance. My grandfather built the foundation of Onyx Holdings from absolutely nothing. I explained, my voice steady, carrying the weight of generational history. He started acquiring commercial real estate in the Deep South during segregation. He bought properties through white proxy buyers because the law would not allow a black man to own land in those districts. He built an empire while smiling politely and playing the role of a humble laborer. He taught me that wealth is a target, and the loudest person in the room is usually the most vulnerable. Nia listened quietly, her sharp legal mind processing the family history. When I met Julian, I wanted a partner. I continued turning to look at her. I wanted a man who loved me for my mind, my spirit, and my drive. I did not want a parasite looking for a host. I knew that if I introduced him to the reality of Onyx Holdings, the billions in assets, the venture capital leverage, the sheer scale of the power, I would never truly know if he loved me or the balance sheet. So I gave him the boutique public relations firm narrative. I gave him a comfortable upper-middle-class life. I gave him the space to be the man he claimed to be. And he failed the test, Nia concluded, shaking her head in disgust. "He did not just fail," I corrected my tone, dropping to a sharp, icy register. "He weaponized the comfort I provided. He used my resources to build a fake kingdom, cheated on me in a house I paid for, and then tried to use his mistress's dying company to bankrupt me and throw me in a federal prison. He mistook my humility for weakness. Today he learns the difference." The Maybach exited the highway and smoothly navigated the busy downtown streets approaching the financial district. The towering glass structure of Sterling Cloud headquarters loomed ahead, a monument to Victoria's unearned arrogance. Marcus pulled the massive vehicle smoothly into the semicircular drop-off zone right in front of the main glass doors. The sudden arrival of the imposing luxury vehicle immediately drew the attention of the corporate drones rushing into the building. Before Marcus could even put the car in park, a matte black Cadillac Escalade pulled up sharply directly behind us. A second later, another Escalade pulled up in front, boxing the Maybach into the VIP zone. The doors of the SUVs swung open simultaneously. 6 massive, broad-shouldered security contractors stepped out onto the pavement. They wore identical black suits, earpieces, and expressions of absolute terrifying neutrality. This was the elite private security detail retained exclusively for the chairman of Onyx Holdings. Marcus stepped out and opened my door. I swung my legs out, the red soles of my stilettos hitting the concrete with a sharp, decisive click. I stepped out of the vehicle, the morning breeze catching the edge of my crimson blazer. The security team immediately moved into a flawless diamond formation, creating an impenetrable human shield around me and Naya as we walked toward the entrance. The heavy glass doors slid open automatically. The Sterling Tower lobby was vast, loud, and echoing with the chaotic energy of a company on the brink of financial collapse. Employees were whispering frantically, clutching their phones, completely terrified about the rumors of frozen payroll accounts. I ignored them all, keeping my gaze locked straight ahead, moving with the synchronized, unstoppable force of my security detail. As we crossed the marble floor toward the private executive elevator bank, I saw them. Brenda, Chloe, and Darnell were standing near the security turnstiles. Brenda was still clutching the ridiculous bouquet of congratulations balloons. Chloe was frozen mid-selfie, her phone hovering uselessly in the air. Darnell was staring with his mouth slightly open, his coffee cup tilting dangerously in his hand. They recognized the crimson suit. They recognized the hair. They recognized the face of the woman they had spent years insulting, belittling, and threatening. But they absolutely could not comprehend the reality unfolding right in front of them. They could not process why the daughter-in-law they treated like trash was currently walking through the lobby of an elite corporate tower surrounded by a paramilitary security force, looking like she owned the very air they were breathing. Brenda took a hesitant step forward, her eyes wide with total confusion. "Maya," she called out, her voice weak and trembling, completely devoid of her usual domineering southern drawl. "Maya, what are you doing here?" I did not break my stride. I did not turn my head. I did not acknowledge her existence with a single flicker of my eyes. The lead security guard smoothly stepped into Brenda's path, placing a massive, unyielding hand out to block her advance without missing a beat. I walked right past them, leaving Brenda clutching her cheap Mylar balloons, her jaw practically resting on the marble floor, while Chloe stared in absolute, unadulterated shock. The private gold elevator doors parted silently. Naya and I stepped inside the security team, filing in perfectly around us. I turned around just as the heavy doors began to close, catching one final glimpse of my former in-laws standing paralyzed in the lobby, drowning in their own delusion. The elevator shot upward, carrying the chairman of Onyx Holdings directly into the war room. The private gold elevator hummed with silent efficiency as it ascended to the 65th floor. The penthouse level of Sterling Tower was entirely dedicated to the executive boardroom, a sprawling fortress of glass, steel, and imported mahogany, where Victoria believed she reigned supreme. Inside that room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The air conditioning was cranked to a freezing temperature, yet the 12 members of the Sterling Cloud Board of Directors were sweating profusely through their custom-tailored suits. They sat rigidly in their ergonomic chairs, their eyes darting nervously toward the heavy double oak doors at the far end of the room. The company was hemorrhaging money by the second. Stocks were plummeting, investors were pulling out. The only thing standing between these executives and total financial ruin was the impending arrival of the anonymous chairman of Onyx Holdings. Victoria sat at the head of the massive table. She had attempted to reconstruct her facade of elite arrogance, smoothing her white designer dress and adjusting her pearl necklace, but the sheer panic vibrating beneath her skin was impossible to conceal. She tapped her manicured fingernails rhythmically against the polished wood, her eyes fixed on the digital clock mounted on the wall. It read 8:58. Beside her, Julian paced like a caged, anxious animal. He was wearing his finest charcoal suit, desperately trying to project the image of a seasoned corporate shark ready to negotiate a billion-dollar bailout. He desperately needed this meeting to validate his existence. He needed to prove to Victoria and the board that he was the visionary co-chief executive officer she had promised he would become. He believed that his natural charm and business acumen would be the key to swaying the mysterious chairman. He had spent the last hour reassuring the terrified board members that he had a flawless pitch prepared, completely ignorant of the fact that he was pitching to a wall. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. The synchronized movement of the massive wooden panels sucked the air out of the boardroom. The 12 executives collectively held their breath, expecting to see a gray-haired, ruthless Wall Street billionaire step across the threshold to decide their fate. Victoria sat up perfectly straight, pasting a brilliant, desperate, welcoming smile across her face. Julian stopped his pacing, puffing out his chest and buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flourish. I stepped through the doorway. The absolute silence that immediately crashed down upon the room was deafening. The sound of my signature Christian Louboutin stiletto pumps hitting the polished hardwood floor echoed like gunshots in a crypt. The vibrant, unapologetic crimson of my bespoke Alexander McQueen suit cut through the sterile, muted corporate gray of the boardroom like a blade. The heavy vintage diamond collar resting against my skin caught the fluorescent lighting, refracting brilliant shards of light across the mahogany table. I did not shrink. I did not politely nod. I walked into the room with the devastating, relaxed posture of an apex predator, stepping into an enclosure full of trapped prey. The board members stared at me in total confusion. They looked at my natural, voluminous crown of hair, my sharp, tailored crimson suit, and the unmistakable aura of absolute authority radiating from my every movement. They did not know who I was, but they instantly recognized power. They recognized that whoever had just walked through those doors owned the very ground they were standing on. Victoria's welcoming smile completely froze on her face. Her eyes darted from my diamond necklace down to my red-soled shoes. Her brain violently struggling to process why the woman she had dismissed as a mediocre party-planning housewife was currently standing in her highly restricted executive boardroom looking like a billionaire. The elitist disdain that usually contorted her features was rapidly being replaced by a creeping, icy sense of absolute dread. Julian, however, completely short-circuited. His eyes bulged out of his head. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pallid gray. He looked at me, then looked wildly at the terrified board members, then looked back at me. His fragile, inflated ego could not comprehend the reality in front of him. His mind, conditioned by years of his own narcissistic delusion, immediately jumped to the most irrational, desperate conclusion possible. He genuinely believed I had somehow bypassed building security, tracked him down, and crashed his career, defining meetings simply to harass him over the divorce. He believed I was a hysterical, bitter woman trying to sabotage his glorious corporate ascension. "Maya, what are you doing?" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic and unhinged fury. He lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "How did you get up here?" I did not break my stride. I continued walking slowly, deliberately toward the center of the long mahogany table, my eyes locked dead onto his terrified face. I let him speak. I let him dig the hole deeper. "This is a highly classified corporate meeting," Julian yelled, his voice echoing frantically off the glass walls. He turned to Victoria, holding his hands up defensively, trying to salvage his image. "I am so sorry, Victoria. She must have followed me. She is completely unstable. She is obsessed with ruining me because I filed the lawsuit this morning." Victoria stared at him. Her lips parted, unable to form a coherent sentence. She looked from Julian back to me, the creeping dread in her chest evolving into sheer, paralyzing terror. Julian spun around to face the double oak doors, his face red with desperate, sweating rage. "Are you crazy?" he screamed at me before yelling out into the hallway. "Security. We have a breach. Get in here right now. Get my crazy ex-wife out of here before she ruins my career. The six massive, broad-shouldered security contractors in identical black suits immediately stepped through the oak doors. Julian let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, visibly relaxing his shoulders. He genuinely expected the men to grab my arms, humiliate me in front of the board, and physically drag me out of the penthouse. He smirked at me, a brief, triumphant look of arrogant satisfaction flashing across his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully put the mediocre, disobedient woman back in her place. The security guards did not even glance in my direction. They bypassed me entirely, moving with terrifying synchronized military precision. Two of the massive men stepped smoothly around Julian, ignoring his frantic pointing finger, and took up defensive, imposing positions directly behind my chair at the head of the table. The other four guards flanked the heavy oak doors, crossing their arms over their chests and standing shoulder to shoulder, completely locking the room down. They formed an impenetrable human barricade. Nobody was coming in, and absolutely nobody was leaving. Julian's triumphant smirk instantly vanished. His mouth fell open. He looked at the guards standing behind me, their eyes staring blankly straight ahead, completely subservient to my presence. He slowly lowered his pointing finger, his hand shaking violently. The realization that these men were not Sterling Cloud security began to dawn on him, crushing the air out of his lungs. Victoria let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth. She recognized the private security insignias pinned to the lapels of their black suits. She knew exactly what kind of wealth was required to retain that specific elite paramilitary firm. Her eyes darted wildly toward the open doorway, searching for the savior she desperately needed. Nia stepped through the heavy oak doors. She walked into the room with the lethal, unbothered grace of a corporate executioner. She wore a sharp, tailored black suit and carried a massive, heavily weighted, leather-bound portfolio under her right arm. She did not look at Julian. She did not look at the sweating board members. She walked directly toward the head of the mahogany table, stopping right beside where I stood. Julian took a clumsy step backward, bumping into a leather chair. "Who are you?" he stammered, his voice dropping to a panicked, terrified whisper. "What is happening? Where is the chairman?" Nia ignored him entirely. She raised the massive leather portfolio high into the air and brought it down onto the polished mahogany table with a devastating, explosive slam. The sound cracked through the boardroom like a thunderclap. Several of the older board members actually jumped in their seats. Victoria flinched violently, her pearl necklace rattling against her collarbone. Julian stumbled backward again, his legs hitting the edge of the glass presentation board. Nia placed her hands flat on top of the leather binder and leaned forward, her sharp gaze sweeping across the 12 terrified executives, lingering on Victoria, and finally locking onto Julian's pathetic, sweating face. She let the silence stretch, forcing them to marinate in their own absolute destruction. "Members of the board," Nia announced, her voice ringing out loud, clear and dripping with absolute, undeniable authority. "I present to you the sole heir to the Onyx estate, the owner of 74% of your corporate shares, and your chairman." Nia stepped to the side, gesturing clearly and perfectly toward me. "Ms. Maya Onyx." The color entirely drained from Julian and Victoria faces. They stood frozen, their eyes locked on me in sheer, unadulterated horror, as their entire world collapsed into dust. I slowly pulled out the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, adjusted my crimson blazer, and took my seat. "I told you I would make sure the chairman was right on time," I said. "Now let us discuss this lawsuit." The silence in the executive boardroom was so absolute that the faint hum of the air conditioning system sounded exactly like a loud jet engine. 12 elite members of the Sterling Cloud Board of Directors, men and women who controlled billions in liquid assets, sat rigidly in their ergonomic chairs. They were sweating profusely through their expensive, custom-tailored suits. Their anxious eyes darted nervously toward the heavy double oak doors at the far end of the room. The company was hemorrhaging money by the second. Market stocks were plummeting rapidly. Nervous secondary investors were actively pulling out their funding. The only thing standing between these powerful executives and total financial ruin was the impending arrival of the anonymous chairman of Onyx Holdings. Victoria sat proudly at the head of the massive polished mahogany table. She had attempted to meticulously reconstruct her facade of elite arrogance, smoothing the wrinkles of her white designer dress and adjusting the antique pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. But the sheer vibrating panic beneath her skin was completely impossible to conceal. She tapped her manicured fingernails rhythmically against the dark wood, her terrified eyes fixed firmly on the digital clock mounted on the wall. It read exactly 8:58. Beside her, Julian paced back and forth like a caged, anxious animal. He was wearing his finest charcoal suit, desperately trying to project the strong image of a seasoned corporate shark ready to negotiate a billion-dollar bailout. He desperately needed this meeting to validate his pathetic existence. He needed to prove to Victoria and the hostile board that he was the visionary co-chief executive officer she promised he would soon become. He truly believed that his natural charm and business acumen would be the ultimate key to swaying the mysterious hidden chairman. He had spent the entire last hour reassuring the terrified board members that he had a flawless, brilliant pitch, prepared completely ignorant of the fact that he was pitching to a brick wall. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. The synchronized movement of the massive wooden panels forcefully sucked the air out of the cold boardroom. The 12 anxious executives collectively held their breath, fully expecting to see a gray-haired, ruthless Wall Street billionaire step across the threshold to decide their ultimate corporate fate. Victoria sat up perfectly straight, pasting a brilliant, desperate, welcoming smile. Julian stopped his frantic pacing, puffing out his broad chest and buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flourish. Maya steps in. The absolute heavy silence that immediately crashed down upon the spacious room was completely deafening. The sharp sound of my signature Christian Louboutin stiletto pumps hitting the polished hardwood floor echoed loudly like literal gunshots in a quiet crypt. The vibrant, unapologetic crimson of my bespoke Alexander McQueen suit cut through the sterile, muted corporate gray of the boardroom like a razor-sharp blade. The heavy vintage diamond collar resting elegantly against my dark skin caught light. I walked directly into the room with the devastating, relaxed posture of a confident apex predator, stepping into an enclosure full of trapped, helpless prey. Julian immediately starts yelling, "Are you crazy, security? Get my crazy ex-wife out of here before she ruins my career!" He screamed, his panicked voice echoing frantically off the clear glass walls. He genuinely expected the massive men entering closely behind me to violently grab my arms, humiliate me in front of the esteemed board, and physically drag me out of the executive penthouse. He smirked at me, a brief triumphant look flashing quickly. He truly thought he had finally won. The security guards do not touch Maya. They flank the doors. They bypassed me entirely, moving with terrifying, highly synchronized military precision. Two of the massive men stepped smoothly around a stammering Julian, completely ignoring his frantic pointing finger, and took up defensive, imposing positions directly behind the empty leather chair at the head of the table. The other four guards crossed their muscular arms tightly over their chests and stood shoulder to shoulder, completely locking the entire room down. They formed a massive, impenetrable human barricade. Nobody was coming in or leaving. Julian's triumphant smirk instantly vanished. His mouth fell wide open as the sudden realization crushed the air completely out of his lungs. Naya steps forward, slamming a massive leather-bound portfolio onto the mahogany table. The sudden sound cracked through the quiet boardroom like a violent thunderclap. Victoria flinched violently. Julian stumbled backward blindly in fear. Naya speaks loudly. "Members of the board, I present to you the sole heir to the Onyx estate, the owner of 74% of your shares, and your chairman, Ms. Maya Onyx." The color entirely drains from Julian and Victoria, faces frozen right there. They stood completely frozen, their wide eyes locked onto me in sheer, unadulterated horror. The boardroom is dead silent. The board members immediately stand up to greet me respectfully. It was an involuntary display of total submission. Julian falls back into his chair, hyperventilating. His shaking hands clawed desperately at his custom silk tie, ripping it loose as if the fabric was suddenly strangling his neck. Sweat poured heavily down his face. Victoria stammers, denying it, calling it a prank. "This is a joke," Victoria stammered loudly. "You plan charity galas, Maya? Get this imposter out of my boardroom immediately." David, the chief financial officer, did not move an inch. He was staring blindly at the watermarked legal documents Nia extracted. He read the bottom line, looked at Victoria with absolute terror, and shook his head before taking his seat in silent, terrified reverence. Maya takes the head seat. I slowly pulled out the leather chair, adjusted my crimson blazer, and sat down. I gestured sharply, and the remaining board members immediately sat. I systematically go through Victoria failures. For the past 36 months, Onyx Holdings has served as your primary lifeline, I began. We injected exactly $800 million based on your aggressive expansion proposals. You lied to us. Victoria opened her mouth to aggressively protest, but the desperate words died in her throat. Let us carefully examine your visionary leadership, Victoria. Over the last 3 quarters, Sterling Cloud bled $50 million. You falsely blamed market fluctuations. However, my forensic accounting team uncovered a much more interesting narrative. You have been systematically bleeding this company completely dry to secretly fund your personal lifestyle brand. I slid a thick stack of printed bank statements across the smooth mahogany surface. You utilized corporate funds to illegally purchase jets. You expensed over $3 million in luxury renovations for your personal residence. You illegally funneled another $2 million into a vanity tech startup owned by your personal fitness trainer. I exposed her complete incompetence. That is felony embezzlement. The angry board members began muttering among themselves, casting furious glares in Victoria's direction. She found absolutely none. I did what I had to do to maintain the elite corporate image of this company, Victoria whispered loudly, tears spilling heavily over her eyelashes. You stole my hard-earned money to secretly buy expensive curtains. I corrected her very coldly right then. I slowly turned my focused attention to the broken man hyperventilating to my left. And then there is Julian, I announced proudly, the brilliant corporate shark, the arrogant man who sat in his mother dining room and loudly declared that I was a mediocre housewife holding back his limitless potential. Julian let out a pathetic soft whimper. Maya, please, he gasped. I flipped to the second detailed section of the heavy portfolio. Victoria promoted you to Senior Vice President of Sales based on a record-breaking quarter, I stated. You reported $40 million in new enterprise contracts very fast. You used that fake success to justify demanding access to my personal wealth. But Julian is not a rainmaker. Julian is a fraudulent failure. I exposed how Julian elite sales numbers were entirely fabricated. He secretly colluded with Victoria to artificially inflate his monthly sales numbers. Those $40 million in new enterprise contracts do not exist. They were signed by shell companies created by Victoria and funded entirely by the Onyx cash injection. The boardroom erupted into total chaos. The executives were shouting, slamming their hands on the table. Julian buried his face in his hands, openly sobbing. Silence, Nia commanded loudly. The room instantly fell quiet again. I enforced the morality clause, I explained. Victoria shook her head desperately. Please do not take my company. It was never your company, Victoria, I stated flatly. Victoria, you are terminated as CEO effective immediately. Your remaining shares are seized to cover the debt you owe Onyx. You are completely ruined today. Victoria let out an agonizing wail. She slumped forward helplessly, entirely broken, weeping. Maya turns her chilling gaze to Julian, who is physically shaking, tears welling in his eyes. She leans forward. Now let's talk about your alimony, Julian. Julian was shaking so violently that his heavy leather-bound oak chair audibly rattled against the polished hardwood floor. The arrogant, imposing sales executive who had confidently demanded my wealth just 24 hours prior was entirely gone. In his place sat a terrified, hyperventilating shell of a man. His custom-tailored charcoal suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too large, hanging loosely over his slumped shoulders. The 12 board members watched him with a mixture of absolute disgust and morbid corporate fascination. Nia stood firmly to my right, her sharp eyes scanning the massive room, while my personal security detail remained planted like giant stone statues by the doors. I slowly opened the heavy leather portfolio, my manicured fingers turning a crisp white page. "You filed an emergency petition for spousal support this morning, Julian." I stated, my voice echoing clearly and coldly through the freezing boardroom. "You alleged that I committed felony wire fraud by moving my own personal funds. You demanded full ownership of my public relations firm. You demanded the Buckhead estate. You demanded the Range Rover. You wanted to bleed me completely dry just to save this sinking corporate ship." Julian opened his mouth, but only a pathetic raspy squeak escaped his throat. He looked desperately at Victoria, silently pleading for her to assert her elite power and save him. But the former chief executive officer was staring blankly at the mahogany table, completely paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic reality of her absolute financial ruin. "You believed my money was your money," I continued, leaning slightly forward in my chair. "You believed your status as a corporate executive entitled you to my wealth. But here is the reality of your situation, Julian. You are not a corporate executive anymore." I pulled a single crisp sheet of paper from the portfolio and slid it precisely across the polished wood. It stopped exactly inches from his trembling, sweating hands. "That is a formal notice of termination for gross misconduct," I announced, my tone dropping to a lethal, icy register. "You are officially fired from Sterling Cloud. You will receive absolutely zero severance pay. Furthermore, my forensic accounting team traced the exact origin of the funds you used to purchase Victoria engagement ring. You did not use your own salary. You authorized an illegal wire transfer from a restricted corporate account directly into your personal checking account. That constitutes felony wire fraud, Julian." The remaining board members gasped audibly. David, the chief financial officer, dropped his expensive silver pen onto the table with a sharp clatter. Victoria whipped her head around, her eyes widening in fresh, unadulterated horror as she realized the massive diamond sitting on her left hand was bought with stolen corporate money. The air in the room grew even colder. "You stole from Onyx Holdings to buy a ring for your mistress," I said, allowing a cold, victorious smile to finally touch my lips. "My legal team has already forwarded the transaction records to the federal authorities. You are not getting alimony, Julian. You are getting a federal indictment." The sheer weight of his complete destruction finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant delusion. Julian looked down at the termination papers, then looked at the furious board members, and finally stared at Victoria. He saw her stripped of her power, stripped of her shares, and stripped of her elite status. She was no longer his golden ticket to the billionaire lifestyle. She was an incredibly heavy anchor tied to a sinking ship, and Julian was absolutely terrified of drowning in the wreckage. The basic survival instinct of a true coward immediately kicked in. Julian abruptly shoved his chair backward. It tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor, but he did not care. Before anyone in the boardroom could fully comprehend what was happening, Julian threw his body forward and dropped hard onto his knees right beside my chair. He clasped his hands together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of total submission, completely abandoning his pride. "Maya, please!" Julian wailed, hot tears suddenly streaming rapidly down his pale cheeks. "You have to listen to me. This was not my fault. She manipulated me. She completely manipulated me." Victoria gasped loudly, pushing herself up from the table. "Julian, what are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer disbelief and rising panic. He completely ignored her, shuffling forward on his knees to get closer to me. The massive security guard standing behind my right shoulder instantly stepped forward, his heavy hand resting firmly on Julian's shoulder, freezing him in place on the hardwood floor. "She seduced me." "Maya," Julian cried out, his voice echoing with absolute sickening desperation. "She preyed on my ambition. I never wanted to leave you. She forced me to do it. She told me that if I did not play along with her corporate games and leave my marriage, she would fire me and destroy my entire career. I was trapped, Maya. I was completely trapped by her elite connections. I had to buy that ring to keep my job. I did it for us. I did it to protect our family. The sheer audacity of his transparent lies hung thickly in the freezing air. The board members stared in stunned, open-mouthed shock. They were witnessing a grown man, a highly paid senior corporate executive, entirely abandon his dignity to grovel and beg for mercy from the woman he had just tried to financially slaughter. "I love you," Julian sobbed uncontrollably, burying his wet face in his shaking hands. "You know I love you. You are my wife. You are my strong black queen. You are the only woman I have ever truly loved. Please, Maya, do not let her destroy my life. Do not let them take me to prison. I will do anything. I will sign whatever you want. Just please take me back." The cringe-inducing use of the phrase "strong black queen" echoed loudly through the room. Nia let out a sharp, genuine snort of laughter, completely unable to contain her amusement at his pathetic, desperate pandering. I simply stared down at him, my expression entirely devoid of sympathy, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Victoria could no longer handle the absolute humiliation of the moment. Her carefully constructed facade of old money elegance violently shattered into a million pieces. The sophisticated heiress was entirely gone. "You pathetic, lying coward," Victoria screamed at the top of her lungs, her face contorting with sheer, unadulterated fury. She lunged wildly across the space between them. Before the security guards could intervene, Victoria grabbed Julian by the collar of his expensive charcoal suit and delivered a vicious, echoing slap directly across his face. The sharp smack sounded exactly like a gunshot in the quiet room. Julian yelled out in sudden pain, tumbling backward onto the floor, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek while staring up at her in terror. "You told me she was a mediocre housewife," Victoria shrieked, standing over him, her chest heaving with furious rage. "You told me she was a nobody. You ruined my company. You stole my money. You are nothing but a cheap, manipulative fraud." The boardroom descended into absolute unprecedented chaos. The two former lovers who had smugly planned my total destruction over morning espresso just an hour prior were now violently tearing each other apart on the floor of the executive penthouse. The board members were shouting loudly for order. David was frantically calling for someone to intervene. Julian was scrambling backward away from Victoria, still crying and pleading for me to save him from the mess he created. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting elegantly on the mahogany table, watching the glorious carnage unfold exactly as I had orchestrated. It was a beautiful symphony of destruction. Right at that precise moment of peak unhinged corporate hysteria, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom violently burst open. The sudden noise caused everyone to freeze immediately. Victoria stopped screaming. Julian stopped scrambling on the floor. The 12 board members turned their heads in collective shock. My security team instantly shifted their stances, preparing to neutralize the new threat, but I raised a single manicured finger, silently instructing them to stand down and let the scene play out. Brenda and Chloe stumbled into the freezing boardroom. They were entirely out of breath, their faces flushed with eager excitement. They had grown impatient waiting in the lobby and had somehow manipulated a junior intern into swiping them up to the highly restricted executive floor. Brenda was still clutching the massive, ridiculous bouquet of silver and gold congratulations balloons. Chloe had her phone out, clearly expecting to record Julian's triumphant moment of corporate ascension for her social media followers. They stepped fully into the room, their smiles wide and ready to celebrate their victory. Then they saw the harsh reality of the situation. They saw the 12 furious board members staring at them angrily. They saw Victoria standing with her hair disheveled, breathing heavily, looking like a wild animal cornered in a cage. And finally, their eyes slowly landed on the center of the room. They saw Julian, the golden son, the promised co-chief executive officer, sitting pathetically on the floor. His face was red from a fresh slap, hot tears streaming down his cheeks, cowering weakly beneath my chair. And then they saw me sitting at the absolute head of the table, wearing $1 million in diamonds and a striking crimson suit flanked by a paramilitary security detail and an elite corporate attorney. The massive mylar balloon slipped slowly from Brenda's fingers and floated uselessly up to the high ceiling. Chloe dropped her phone. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, but she did not even flinch to retrieve it. Their brains simply could not process the impossible, devastating tableau unfolding right in front of them. Julie Brenda whispered, her voice trembling with absolute, unadulterated confusion. "Baby, what is happening? Why are you on the floor? Where is the chairman?" Julian could not answer her. He just buried his wet face in his hands and continued to sob loudly, entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of his public humiliation. He had lost everything in a matter of minutes. Brenda slowly turned her gaze toward me. The reality of the absolute power dynamic finally began to penetrate her thick layer of Southern entitlement. She saw the total control I commanded over the entire room. She saw the powerful board members deferring silently to my presence. Her mind scrambled frantically to find a way to survive the fallout of her terrible decisions. The arrogant, overbearing mother-in-law, who had constantly insulted my cooking, my hair, and my ambition, instantly vanished into thin air. She quickly painted on a desperate, sickeningly sweet smile. She took a hesitant step toward the head of the table, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that her own son was crying on the floor. She realized that I was the ultimate source of the wealth she so desperately craved. She realized I was the anonymous billionaire she had come to appease. "Maya, baby." Brenda cooed, her voice dripping heavily with fake desperate affection. "What a wonderful surprise. We knew you were special. We always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. This is all just a big misunderstanding. Julian is just stressed. You know exactly how boys get when they are under immense corporate pressure. But we are family, Maya. We stick together through thick and thin." Chloe nodded vigorously behind her mother, her eyes wide with greedy, pathetic hope. "Yeah, Maya, we are sisters. We are family." I looked at Brenda. I looked closely at her fake smile and heard the hollow desperation ringing clearly in her voice. I thought about the legal eviction notices currently being nailed to the front door of the Buckhead estate. I thought about the sheer unearned audacity of these terrible people. I did not smile. I did not blink. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the lead security contractor standing firmly by the heavy oak doors. "Escort these trespassers out," I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute chilling authority of a woman who owned the world. "Give them cardboard boxes for their desk toys." The massive security contractors did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Two towering guards stepped forward, gripping Brenda and Chloe firmly by their upper arms. Brenda let out a loud, indignant squawk, dropping her expensive designer handbag as her sensible heels scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She demanded to speak to the manager, completely oblivious to the fact that I now owned the entire building. Chloe thrashed wildly, screaming about a lawsuit and her social media followers, but the guards simply lifted her off her feet and marched her swiftly out the double oak doors. Julian remained on the floor, curled into a pathetic, trembling ball of sheer regret, until two more guards dragged him away by the collar of his ruined charcoal suit. I did not watch them leave. I simply turned my attention back to the remaining board members who were sitting in terrified absolute silence, waiting for their new chairman to dictate their future. Exactly 14 days later, the brutal, unrelenting news cycle painted a vivid picture of absolute corporate slaughter. The front page of every major financial publication and business network broadcasted the exact same devastating headline: Sterling Cloud acquired by Onyx Holdings in hostile takeover. Former Chief Executive Officer under federal investigation. The television screens inside every coffee shop and airport lounge played endless, repeating loops of Victoria being escorted out of her luxury high-rise condominium in shiny steel handcuffs. The federal authorities had moved with terrifying speed. Once my forensic accounting team handed over the unredacted ledgers, proving massive corporate fraud and wire-tampering the government, froze every single bank account tied to Victoria's name. She was currently sitting under house arrest, wearing a bulky black ankle monitor, facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Her elite society friends immediately abandoned her. Her country club revoked her membership. The massive stolen diamond engagement ring she had proudly flaunted was seized as evidence. She was reduced to absolutely nothing, a disgraced pariah in the very same wealthy circles she used to ruthlessly dominate. The devastating domino effect did not stop at the corporate level. The absolute destruction rapidly trickled down to every single person who had participated in my torment. Brenda's entire world collapsed with the speed of a violent avalanche. Without Julian's inflated corporate salary and his stolen corporate expense accounts to illegally float her extravagant lifestyle, the bank immediately moved forward with the foreclosure on the Buckhead estate. The eviction officers arrived on a bright Tuesday morning. Brenda stood on her manicured front lawn, weeping hysterically in her silk bathrobe as burly men ruthlessly carried her antique furniture, her fake designer clothing, and her expensive porcelain collections out to the curb. Her prestigious neighborhood association simply watched from behind their drawn curtains, offering absolutely zero sympathy for the woman who had spent years acting superior to them. Darnell faced his own spectacular public humiliation just 3 days later. He had organized a massive neighborhood cookout, eager to show off the brand-new, fully loaded sports car he had leased, using Julian-forged income statements as a reference. He was standing proudly by the grill, flipping burgers, and bragging loudly to a crowd of his jealous friends about his elite corporate connections. Right in the middle of his arrogant monologue, a heavy tow truck loudly backed into his driveway. Two grim-faced repossession agents stepped out carrying heavy chains and a legal clipboard. Darnell tried to argue, puffing out his broad chest and shouting aggressive threats, but the agents simply handed him the default notice. His entire neighborhood watched in highly amused silence as the repossession truck hoisted his beloved sports car into the air and drove away, leaving Darnell standing in his driveway, holding a plastic spatula, completely stripped of his unearned pride. Julian had fallen the absolute furthest. The arrogant visionary corporate shark who had arrogantly demanded my wealth was now dead broke and entirely unemployable. The news of his termination for gross misconduct and his involvement in federal wire fraud had spread through the corporate world like a highly contagious virus. No reputable company would even look at his resume. His assets were completely frozen, pending the ongoing federal investigation. He was forced to take a minimum wage job, working the night shift, at a local greasy fast food restaurant, just to afford basic survival. The man who used to wear $2,000 bespoke suits and sip vintage scotch in executive penthouses was now wearing a cheap polyester uniform, smelling heavily of stale frying oil and stale regret. With his luxury downtown apartment seized and his bank accounts locked, Julian had absolutely nowhere to go. He was currently sleeping on a lumpy, stained futon inside Chloe's cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment. He spent his miserable nights staring blankly at the ceiling, surrounded by boxes of Chloe cheap influencer merchandise and unpaid utility bills. Chloe resented his presence entirely, constantly yelling at him for ruining their lives and failing to secure my money. Every single day was a waking nightmare of poverty, constant bickering, and crushing, inescapable humiliation. It was during one of his miserable, sleepless nights on that cramped futon that Julian made the ultimate soul-crushing discovery. He was desperately scrolling through public property records on his cracked smartphone, searching blindly for any remaining asset he might be able to leverage or claim in the ongoing divorce proceedings. He searched my name. He searched the corporate holdings of Onyx Estate. He kept digging through the municipal tax databases, looking for the modest townhome he assumed I had rented after he so generously kicked me out of his apartment. Instead, the database returned a stunning, impossible result. It was a massive, sprawling 20-acre private estate, located in the most exclusive, heavily guarded zip code in the entire state. The property featured a 10,000-square-foot primary mansion, pristine private lakes, highly secured perimeter walls, and an elite security gate. Julian stared at the glowing screen, his eyes burning, his hands shaking violently as he read the purchase date. I had owned the estate the entire time we were married. While he was loudly mocking me for being a mediocre, financially dependent housewife, I was secretly holding the deed to a property worth more than his entire projected lifetime earnings. While he was treating me like an uneducated burden, I was quietly returning to a fortress of absolute, untouchable wealth every time he went on a business trip. The realization hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. I had never needed him. I had never depended on him. I had simply been observing him, watching him dig his own grave while holding the absolute ultimate trump card. The crushing weight of his monumental stupidity finally shattered his fragile sanity. He realized that he had willingly thrown away a life of unimaginable luxury and true partnership just to chase a fake, shallow corporate illusion that ultimately destroyed him. He desperately needed to fix it. He needed to apologize. He needed to beg. Julian left Chloe's apartment in the middle of the night. He did not have a car, so he walked. He walked for 4 exhausting, agonizing hours through the dark, unforgiving city streets. The sky broke open, unleashing a heavy, freezing, pouring rain that instantly soaked his cheap fast food uniform to the bone. He dragged his tired, aching feet up the long, winding private road leading into the exclusive hills, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. He finally arrived at the massive wrought iron gates of my private estate. The towering stone pillars loomed above him like ancient, unforgiving guardians. Heavy security cameras tracked his every single pathetic movement from the shadows. The freezing rain plastered his hair to his forehead and washed away the tears violently streaming down his face. Julian stumbled forward, his hands gripping the cold, wet iron bars. He found the glowing silver intercom button mounted on the stone pillar and pressed it frantically with his shaking thumb. He pressed it over and over again, his body shivering uncontrollably in the freezing downpour. "Maya, please," he screamed into the metal speaker, his voice cracking with absolute raw agony. "Please answer me. I am so sorry. I was blind. I was so stupid. Please give me another chance. I have absolutely nothing. I need you. Please, Maya." He dropped down to his shaking knees in the deep, muddy puddles forming at the base of the massive gate, clinging desperately to the cold iron bars, like a drowning man holding onto a fragile piece of driftwood. He stared up at the silent, glowing intercom camera, sobbing uncontrollably into the dark, stormy night. He kept crying out my name loudly, waiting there in pure, agonizing desperation for an answer that he truly did not know would ever finally come, shivering violently as the heavy, freezing rain continuously washed away his pathetic, miserable tears forever. I watched him through the massive screen in my private theater. The high-definition security cameras captured every single detail of his total collapse. The infrared sensors highlighted the shivering of his fragile shoulders against the freezing rain. His face was contorted in a mask of absolute agony as he screamed my name into the intercom. A few months ago, this sight would have shattered my heart. I would have rushed out into the storm, thrown my arms around him, and done everything in my immense power to fix his broken life. I would have sacrificed my own comfort to shield his fragile ego. But tonight I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger. There was no residual sadness. There was no vengeful thrill or triumphant malice watching the man who had tried to destroy me drown in the consequences of his own terrible choices. I simply felt bored. I reached forward and picked up the brushed steel remote resting on the leather console. I stared at his moving lips on the screen for one final fleeting second before I pressed the red button. The audio feed instantly cut out. The frantic begging, the pathetic apologies, the desperate promises all vanished into the silent void. He was now just a silent, moving picture of a weak man trapped outside a fortress he could never penetrate again. I tossed the remote aside and leaned back into the plush velvet chair, completely detaching myself from the miserable ghost of my past. The heavy acoustic doors of the theater swung open behind me. Nia walked into the dim room carrying 2 tall crystal flutes and a frosted bottle of vintage Dom Perignon. She wore a stunning emerald green silk robe, her natural hair perfectly styled, moving with the quiet grace of a woman who knew she had flawlessly executed a masterclass. We did not need to speak about the pathetic spectacle at the main gates. My security detail had already received their strict standing orders. If he attempted to scale the wrought iron fence or refused to vacate the premises within the next 10 minutes, they were to contact the local authorities and have him arrested for criminal trespassing. He was no longer my problem. He was a minor landscaping nuisance. Nia handed me a cold crystal flute and filled it to the brim with the sparkling golden liquid. The delicate bubbles caught the ambient light of the theater screen, casting a warm glow over our dark skin. We turned away from the massive monitor, completely ignoring the silent, frantic man begging in the rain. We walked together out of the theater and down the long, sprawling hallway, adorned with priceless original black art and heritage pieces that my grandfather had meticulously collected over his lifetime. We stepped out through the massive sliding glass doors onto the main balcony. The freezing rain had not reached this elevation yet. The crisp night air felt refreshing against my face. The sprawling, glittering skyline of the city stretched out endlessly beneath us. From this towering vantage point, I could see the bright shining logo of the Sterling Cloud headquarters, completely dwarfed by the massive towering skyscrapers owned by Onyx Holdings. The visual representation of my generational wealth was absolute and undeniable. I took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the sweet scent of absolute freedom. For years, I had willingly folded myself into a tiny, manageable box just to make a weak, insecure man feel incredibly tall. I had actively hidden my sharp brilliance, muted my immense power, and disguised my vast fortune, because society had wrongly conditioned me to believe that a strong, successful Black woman had to shrink herself to secure love and acceptance. I had patiently played the quiet, supportive housewife while my husband used my stolen resources to build a fraudulent empire of lies and deceit. I would never make that exact same devastating mistake ever again in my life. I had successfully protected the immense legacy my ancestors had bled to build. I had ruthlessly, completely dismantled the corrupt executives who attempted to steal my inheritance and expanded my corporate empire with surgical, lethal precision. The Onyx estate was not only entirely secure, but exponentially more powerful than it had ever been in its long, storied history. I had decisively reclaimed my rightful throne and secured my future. I looked over at Nia. She was my brilliant attorney, my fiercely loyal confidant, and a shining, beautiful testament to the unbreakable power of Black sisterhood. We had navigated the treacherous, shark-infested waters of elite corporate America and emerged completely victorious without ever compromising our integrity or our undeniable power. We did not need validation from the mediocre men who tried to exploit our brilliance. We were the absolute architects of our own incredible destiny. This vast, glittering empire did not define my worth. It simply amplified the powerful, brilliant woman I had always been. I raised my crystal glass high into the cold, crisp night air. The golden champagne caught the bright city lights, shining like liquid fire in the darkness. Nia raised her glass to meet mine, a knowing, triumphant smile spreading across her beautiful face. We did not offer a toast to Julian or Victoria or the pathetic ashes of their ruined lives. They were entirely irrelevant, dust swept away by the wind. We toasted to our ancestors, to our brilliance, to our undeniable power, and to the limitless, breathtaking horizon stretching out beautifully before us. The sharp, ringing chime of the fine crystal glasses meeting echoed clearly across the sprawling balcony, ringing out like a beautiful, victorious bell in the quiet night. I took a slow and very deliberate sip of the vintage champagne, letting the crisp, bright taste wash over my tongue. I looked out over the glowing city, a fierce, brilliant smile finally touching my lips. I was Maya Onyx. I was a strong, brilliant, wealthy Black queen, and my reign had only just begun.